Fort Huger, also pronounced Hugie, is an earthen fortification on the northern edge of Burrell Bay, directly across the James River's Newport News, and further northwest are the cities of Williamsburg and Richmond. Today, the 22-acre fort is a park owned and operated by Isle of Wight County. On a site formerly known as Hardy's Bluff, Harden's Bluff, and Mother Tyne's Bluff, the forts overlooking the deep, navigable channel offshore made this location a strategic military position. During the American Civil War, a fort was built here for the observation of activity along the river. In 1861, Confederate State Engineer Andrew Talcott was assigned the task of surveying and designing potential defenses along the James River to protect against the Union naval assault upon the Confederate capital of Richmond, located 60 miles upriver.
The fort is built on a bluff. We know exactly how the fort was planned. This is the James River here, and you can see how the James narrows here. We had Mulberry Point batteries on the other side, and you had Fort Huger on this side. There are actually two channels, and the guns at Mulberry Island could cover what they call the swash channel, and the guns at Fort Huger could cover the main channel. The distance wouldn't allow, overshot or crossfire, but they could cover both channels.
The fort was named for Confederate General Benjamin Huger, commander of the Department of Norfolk. Other fortifications along the James River included Fort Boykin, Mulberry Island, Jamestown, and Drury's Bluff. An additional series of trenches, earthworks, and forts extended from Gloucester Point across the Virginia Peninsula to this side of the James River. All of Confederate Major General Magruder's defensive line against the Union, effectively blocking the Union's land approach to Richmond and closing the York and James Rivers as supply routes for their armies.
Major General Benjamin Huger, he actually wrote the very first U.S. Army treatise on artillery. He's sort of considered the father of U.S. Army artillery practice. He was never here. Headquarters in Norfolk for about 10 months when the Confederates occupied Norfolk.
Construction of the fort began in 1861 under the command of Captains E.T.D. Myers and John Clark, and closely followed Talcott's plan. To supplement their limited workforce, the Confederacy hired free blacks and slaves to help construct the fort.
The free blacks were the masons, the carpenters. We actually found in the archives of Virginia, one of the documents says they had 1,000 hands to build forts Boykin and Huger. So we assumed that there were 500 here and probably 500 at Fort Boykin. So you got, 1,000 men here, 500 white troops, 500 black slaves. The free blacks, the expertise, carpenters, masons, they were paid 50 cents a day. The slave owners were paid 25 cents a day.
Fort Huger, like almost all fortifications erected during the war, was built entirely of earth, using only mid-19th century hand tools and a few horse-drawn implements. The fort's construction was a challenge. Axes were in short supply, and there were conflicts regarding the fort's leadership. But today, visitors can walk along the original trace of the road to the fort and see the fort's architecture. During the Civil War, soldiers, work crews, and wagons entered from this direction as well.
This is the encampment area where two companies of the 5th Virginia Battalion made their winter camp.
Fort Huger's troops were comprised of men from Henrico, Dinwiddie, Prince George, Greensville, and Brunswick counties. 5 companies of this battalion were stationed here from October 1861 to May 1862. 3 companies were outside the fort, and 2 companies were positioned inside. In this space, and under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher Archer, soldiers guarded the landward approach to Fort Huger. They slept, ate, and relaxed here when not actively engaged in the daily routine of improving the fort or otherwise preparing for its defense.
Colonel Fletcher Archer himself lived in a home about a mile away, so he didn't actually live, on the fort itself.
This modern bridge is constructed over the trace of the original 1861 bridge.
The original bridge ended probably about where we are right now, because it was probably about 6 or 8 feet below us built over the marsh. It's not a waterway. It's not connected to the James River. This is what they call a vernal pond. Has water in the spring, sometimes in the fall. What you see down here are cypress knees.
The fort's interior occupies 3 acres and is protected by a high rampart wall. The surrounding forest was completely cleared between mid-March and May of 1862. The absence of trees provided no cover for approaching enemy units and created a challenge for the Union ships' guns to accurately fire upon the fort. To enter the fort, soldiers entered the sally port. Just before the entrance is a dry ditch which extends the full length of the fort's exterior. When filled with sharpened stakes referred to as abatis or chevaux de frise.
Okay, we're all inside the fort now. That's the sally port. For obvious defensive reasons, they tried to have only one entrance into the fort, one entrance to defend. But this little feature here, even though the road we put in is sort of S-shaped, it's actually a Z shape. It goes straight from the bridge to that point right over there, all right? And then comes straight across to this point and then back into the fort. It's called a retrenchment in French. The idea was if enemy had broken through, the Confederate musketmen would have been lined up. You've heard the term last-ditch defense.
The wide, flat expanse of the fort center is the parade ground, and near the center is the flagpole. This was the point where the fort's construction began. Earth was pushed from this spot to widen and flatten the space. Remnants of the shell house and hot shot furnace can still be seen. The shell house, a long enclosure covered with earth, served as shelter for the fort's ammunition supply, specifically the exploding shells charged with black powder and armed with a timed fuse. Solid iron shot coated with a protective layer of coal tar could be safely stored outside next to the cannons, but the more sensitive exploding shells had to be protected from the effects of adverse weather. Fuses, once wet, could not function properly. The shot furnace was blown up by retreating Confederates in May 1862. Such ovens were standard in all seacoast defense forts. Solid iron cannonballs were heated over a coal fire within this furnace. The artillery crew loaded this hot shot onto a metal cradle and then quickly loaded the ball into the muzzle of charged cannon. This dangerous procedure and subsequent aim and ricochet firing could set wooden ships on fire, but it was not a successful technique for ironclads or ironcladded vessels such as the Galena. The fort's powder magazine was constructed of brick. It stored hundreds of pounds of black powder used to charge cannons before firing. This was the most dangerous place in the fort because an accidental ignition or a hit by enemy fire could produce disastrous effects. The fort was armed with cannons along the river, and the interior was protected by the land's natural geography, earthworks, and swamp.
When he designed it, he made positions for 18 guns. When it was actually built, they only put in 12.
Armaments were brought via barge from Gosport Navy Yard in Portsmouth. They were hauled up the embankments into position and included Columbiads, Dahlgrens, and 32-pounders.
They built a huge sand ramp from the beach, on an incline, and then hauled the guns, which weighed about, 5 or 6 tons each, up the sand ramp. And then once all the guns were in place, they eliminated the sand ramp, for obvious reasons. There are 4 bomb proofs. These were dug down about 6 feet, covered with wood, and then probably about 2 or 3 feet of earth on top of those. And the entrances were on the rear side here. When the enemy shelling was coming in, the Confederate gunners, they could take a little bit of refuge in one of these bomb proofs until the shelling sort of slacked off, and then they would run out and man the guns.
The fort was engaged in 1862. On May 4th, Magruder abandoned his defensive line in the face of the overwhelming Union forces. With the land route to Richmond cleared, the Union focused their attention on the Confederate forts blocking the James River. On May 8th, the USS Galena, USS Port Royal, and USS Aroostook attacked both Fort Huger and Fort Boykin, with the worst of the fire directed at Fort Boykin. The Port Royal and Aroostook fired from the deeper James River channel, while the Galena moved in closer. Both forts eventually ceased fire as their cannons were not powerful enough to damage the ironclad Galena or to reach the two ships beyond her. The bombardments convinced the Confederates that these forts were untenable, and they were abandoned. U.S. Marines landed and occupied Fort Boykin and Huger on May 17th and 18th to find most of the guns spiked, the carriages burned, and structures within the forts destroyed. Fort Huger became an example of the South's outmoded defense system against the North's modern naval inventions.
All the soldiers were withdrawn and joined other units, other Confederate units. The 5th Virginia Infantry Battalion ceased to exist as a unit, became a couple of the companies in the 53rd Infantry Regiment, Virginia, eventually became part of Armistead's brigade, a brigade, of infantry regiments, and part of Pickett's division. We know the names of 30 of those guys that were killed in Pickett's charge. We call them the Huger Boys. They were very proud of what they did here. We have a number of accounts of Confederate soldiers that wrote from here, and they were very proud of the fact that they held off the entire Union blockading squadron for 9 months.
From inside the fort, visitors can see what remains of the James River Reserve Fleet.
It was started in 1917, before we actually went to war in World War I. President Wilson told Newport News to start building transport ships, and they started building them, but they had no use for them because the war hadn't started, so they stored them right out here. They eventually ended up with about 300 of the old coal-fired merchant ships out here. Of course, once the war started, World War I, took them all out, served in World War I. After World War I, they brought many, many ships, several hundred back here to store them. Up until 1941 or so, there were about 300 or 400 ships out there, basically World War I vintage. Once World War II started, they took all them out. Of course, at the end of World War II, they had even more ships to contend with that they didn't want to scrap. And so that's when actually the reserve fleet came into being. But over the years, over the last 3 or 4 decades, they've taken them all out, and they've left, I think there are either 3 or 4 left, and they still use them for training.
Once the fort was abandoned, it did not become a signaling station like Fort Boykin. But into the 20th century, there was forest growth and subsequent logging which changed the viewshed of the site and surrounding area. In the mid-2000s, Isle of Wight County and the community worked to reclaim the site and establish it as a park. It was dedicated to the county citizens in 2008 and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, Virginia Landmarks Register, Virginia Civil War Trails, Captain John Smith's Trail, and Chesapeake Bay Gateways Network. The park is open to visitors year-round for self-guided tours and guided tours hosted by the Isle of Wight County Museum.